A comedian walks into a bar. A chameleon. A comedian? A chameleon walks into a bar. A chameleon walks into a comedian in the bar. A chameleon walks into a bar and nobody notices. A chameleon walks into another chameleon in the bar. Wasn't that just an accident waiting to happen? A chicken walks into a bar. A chicken walks into a bar and the barman says, "I'm fairly sure you're in the wrong joke." An elephant. An elephant walks into a room, but we're not allowed to talk about it. People avoid talking about it, really. A manic depressive trucker drives into the bar. A monster truck drives into a bar. Monster truck drives into the bar and the barman says, "Shit." And the door opens and a horse gets out, and the horse gets out of the driver's side door and walks over to the bar, and the barman looks at the horse and says, "Why the long wheelbase?" And the horse says, "It's a monster truck, that's how it's designed. It's a kind of a hybrid 4x4 vehicle. It needs to be long and tall. Otherwise it wouldn't be described as a monster truck." Blind chameleon and a deaf bat walk into a bar, and they've been hanging out with each other because they're compensating for each other's sort of sensory deprivation, like that movie Enemy Mine. A blind chameleon and a deaf bat, like in Enemy Mine, walk into a bar and they have no idea where they are. A chameleon falls in a forest. If a chameleon falls in a forest and dies in the forest unnoticed and invisible, isn't that just too much camouflage? Jesus walks into a bar. Jesus walks into some water. Jesus walks into some water which nobody found as remotely as impressive as his last gig. Jesus gate crashes a wedding. Beatles walk into the bar, and before the barman can say anything, the Beatles say in that Beatley sort of way, "The thing about us is that we're bigger than Jesus." And the barman says, "You're not bigger than Jesus." And John Lennon says, "Yeah, we definitely are. We're definitely bigger than Jesus." And the barman says, "No, you're not. He's over there. I've just seen him. You're not bigger than him." And then the barman made Jesus and John Lennon, because he was the tallest one, made him and Jesus stand back to back, and they measured him, and they found out that they were roughly the same height. And it was very embarrassing for the Fab Four: John, Paul, the invisible girl, the man who caught fire, and the giant stony guy on drums. And the barman says, "Some say he was born of a virgin and invented furniture. Some say that donkeys are not waterproof. All we know is they aren't waterproof. If it's something to do with the weave of their coats, they've only got one sort of cut of donkey wool. Some say that an atom of iridium contains 77 electrons and 116 neutrons and has 36 known isotopes. All we know is it does. That's a fair description of iridium." A man walks into a bar with a mutilated dog. And the barman says, "I can't help noticing, sir, but your dog has no nose." And the man says, "You're quite right. My dog has no nose." And the barman says, "How does it smell?" And the man says, "It can't smell. It doesn't have a nose." You probably also recognise, my dog has no tongue either. And the barman says, "Your dog's got no tongue? How does he taste?" "I would never eat my dog. That would be disgusting. That would be wrong. Also, my dog, you probably noticed, has no face. My dog has no face. Your dog has no face. My dog has no face." The barman says, "Your dog's got no face. How does it function in any sensory capacity at all. And the man says, obviously it can't, it's got no face, which is not quite as bad as the principal problem, which is my dog has no moral compass. Your dog's got no moral compass. How does it tell right from wrong? And the man says, it can't tell right from wrong. It's a dog. A tired and dishevelled man walks into the bar. And the barman says, "Good evening, sir. You look tired and dishevelled." And the man says, "Yeah, I've been having sex all weekend with a woman from the West Indies." And the barman says, "Jamaica?" And the man says, "Yes, there was an element of force involved. And then I cut her nose off." And the barman says, "You cut her nose off?" And the man says, "Yes." And the barman says, "How does she smell?" And the man says, "I don't know, she's not returning my calls." An Englishman, Irishman, Scotsman walk into a bar, and there's a lamp, a magical lamp on the table, and the Englishman rubs it, and the Irishman rubs it, and the Scotsman rubs it, and a genie comes out of the lamp, and the genie says, "Greetings, I am the genie of the lamp. You freed me from my incarceration, and I'd like to grant you each a wish, because that's what I do." And the Englishman says, I will be going first. What I'm looking for is, I often have a problem when I drop small objects onto the floor, and I've got quite a stiff back, and my knees aren't what they used to be. And I'd like some kind of device, like a claw, like with a trigger, with some kind of mechanism, so that I can pick up objects that I've dropped on the floor. And the genie looks at the Englishman, and he turns to the Scotsman, and he says, "What can I do for you, Scotsman?" And the Scotsman says, "Well, my particular problem, what I really like, is I got this Mercedes, and when I bought it, it had like conventional wheels, and I bought 4 alloys for it. But the spare wheel isn't an alloy and has different bolts. And what I'd really like is an alloy wheel with some matching bolts." And the genie just looks at the Scotsman with a look of magical exasperation, and turns to the Irishman and says to the Irishman, "Well, what can I get you?" And the Irishman says, "Well, what really is irritating me is the fact that my phone is connected to my wall by a wire. What I'm looking for is some method of transporting my phone, perhaps shrinking it down and then transporting it around with me." The genie says, "Yeah, but the thing about all these things is they're not appropriate wishes for a genie, because I'm a magical force. I can grant you anything you want, and what you have wished for are things that you can buy in a shop. You know, my wishes are supposed to be imbued with sort of, satirical or moral or humorous import. They're supposed to have some kind of consequence. I know you've ruined it. You've ruined it. So what I want you to do is I want you to wish again." And the Englishman, he's really taking it seriously this time. He says, "Yeah, the issue that I have, genie, what I would really like, really putting my mind to it, is in my house, I have got, in my walls, there are spaces in my walls that I can see out of. So I'm inside, but I can see through the holes into the outside. But the problem with the holes is, although I like looking at the outside, the problem is they let the weather from the outside inside the house. So what I'm looking for is some kind of method of, blocking up the windows, but I can still see through them. Perhaps by, some kind of technology that allows some kind of transparent thing in the holes." And the genie, "Your wish is my command," and lo and behold, the Englishman's wishes come true. And the genie turns to the Scotsman, and his hopes are not high. And the Scotsman says, Well, Mr. Genie, the thing that really, apart from the alloy wheels, the thing that really consumes me is the fact that I like bread. I like eating bread and I like drinking milk, and I would like some way to combine the two things. Now, what I've tried to do is I've tried to pour milk onto my bread, but that makes the milk, that ruins the taste of the milk, and it makes the bread all soggy. So what I'm looking for is some method by which I can turn the milk into and the genie's fairly sure he knows where this is going. The genie says, You're looking for a way to convert the milk into like a spreadable solid. Is that it? Yes, it is. Like ice cream, for example. Like ice cream, but not sweet. Says the Scotsman, I don't want it to be sweet. It's got to be like ice cream that I can spread on my bread, but not sweet, like a savoury thing. And the genie thinks about it, and being magical, and he grants his wish, and the Scotsman gets what he wishes for, and he turns to the Irishman. And the Irishman says, the thing that really vexes me is this notion of all the women that I know, most of the women that I know, they have this issue in which they bleed from their vaginas on almost a regular, almost like a monthly basis. It's like they're caught in some kind of cycle of bleeding. And I've noticed this, and I was wondering if there's some method by which, some kind of cork, perhaps some method by which they could sort of stem or plug or make less inconvenient this sort of monthly bleeding, and the genie recognises the sincerity of the Irishman's wish, and he grants that too, and they all live happily ever after, and the genie is free to go visiting other cultural stereotypes, granting fantastic wishes. An itinerant stand-up comedian walks into a bar, and he's touring the imaginary bars of the world looking for imaginary work. And he walks up to the barman and he says, "Have you got any work?" The barman says, "What kind of stuff do you do?" And the comedian says, "Well, I sort of specialise in, that comedy that, the comedy that involves how things are now as compared to how things used to be. That sort of drawing the humour out of then versus now, using the power of memory to extract, light irony and satirical amusement." And that's the kind of stuff I do. And the barman, we love that stuff here. We love that stuff here in the bar. Yeah, you're hired. You're hired. So the imaginary barman hires the imaginary stand-up comedian to work in the imaginary bar, which is good for the whole ambience of the bar. Do you remember women? Do you remember lollipops? Do you remember slush puppies? Do you remember lollipops and slush puppies didn't used to taste of menstruation? Do you remember that? That was good, that, wasn't it? Do you remember when shops sold confectionery? Do you remember when salt and vinegar crisps used to be in blue packets, but they're no longer in blue packets, now they're in green packets, but slush puppies were always blue? Do you remember when slush puppies came in pink? No, that's not right, is it? Do you remember Monster Munch? Do you remember when there was only one flavour of Monster Munch? Do you remember when there was only one flavour of Monster Munch, but then there were more flavours of Monster Munch? Do you remember when they added flavours to the range of Monster Munch for some reason? Do you remember when they crisps swap flavours and or colours? Do you remember that? Do you remember when you never used to ignore elephants? Do you remember when the elephant in the room was a cause for discussion? Do you remember that? Do you remember an octopus and an elephant and a chameleon walk into the room, and everybody ignores the elephant and nobody can see the chameleon, so they have to talk about the octopus? Isn't that just redolent of how things are and how they used to be? Do you remember when Garibaldi used to be a biscuit, and then he turned out to be some kind of Marxist adjutant member of the Italian Risorgimento? Do you remember that? Do you remember Piedmont? Do you remember King Victor Emmanuel of Piedmont? Is that how I pronounce it, do you think? Do you remember when Piedmont used to be pronounced Piedmont? Piedmont. It's like a French Italian. Do you remember when Garibaldi could pronounce Piedmont? Do you remember when King Victor Emmanuel of Piedmont committed himself along with Garibaldi to the Risorgimento? Do you remember that? Do you remember do you remember bicycles? Do you remember when you remember bicycles? Do you remember bicycles? Do you remember when you used to ride bicycles? Do you remember the special kinds of different types and brands of bicycles that you used to have? Do you remember that? Do you remember Sir Frank Whittle's original design for the jet engine? Do you remember that? Do you remember when you first saw that? Do you remember when people didn't used to have massive TVs? They used to sit closer to the small ones to give the effect of having a big one. Do you remember when there were no TV channels? There was just, or there two. Do you remember when there was two or one or none, but there was nothing on? Which is different from now, when there are like 1,000 million. There are 1,000. There are 10,000 TV channels, and there's nothing on, is there? And remember when you just used to sit in the dark and project candles onto poorly made string puppets. Do you remember that? Do you remember that? Do you remember Pangea? Do you remember continental drift? Do you remember Wegener's idea of the sort of continental migration of animals across land masses? Do you remember that? Do you remember Pangea? Or Pangea? I'm not quite sure how you pronounce that. Do you remember that? Do you remember the expansion of the universe from a singularity, from one infinitely small single point? Do you remember that explosion? That was quite memorable. Do you remember how memorable that was? You probably don't. You've probably forgotten now. It was so quick. Some people say it was a bang, but of course it wasn't a bang. There was no sound because there was, just sound can't travel in a vacuum. It was like a big. Do you remember the big? Meanwhile, back at the bar, away from the stage where the stand-up comedian is talking about the Italian Risorgimento, the space-time continuum, walks into a bar and the barman says, "I'm sorry, sir, we don't serve abstract concepts, but if you'd like to take a seat over in that booth, a waitress would have been with you sometime in the future to have already taken your order." Darth Vader walks into a bar. Darth Vader walks into a knotty ethical dilemma involving Alderaan. Darth Vader walks into the bar and he says to the barman, "I know what Luke Skywalker is getting for Christmas." I know what Luke Skywalker's getting for Christmas. And the barman says, "Don't tell him, please. He's still very fragile, especially after that incest thing that we've previously not discussed." A frog and a chicken walk into a casserole, and some people said it was tasteless, but others just said it lacked variety. A Vietnamese doctor with an interrogative surname walks into the bar, and the barman says, "Aren't you Doctor Who? Aren't you Doctor Who?" And the doctor says, "Actually, it's pronounced Doctor Who. Hugh." And the barman says, "You've changed. And not for the better, I may add. You used to be a modest man before you qualified as a doctor." A genetic engineer and his pedant girlfriend walk into a bar, and the barman says, "What do you get if you cross a kangaroo with a sheep?" And the genetic engineer says, "That's just playing God, isn't it?" The barman says, "What do you get if you cross the North Sea in a Viking longship?" And the girlfriend says, "Well, technically speaking, it's not a longship. That was the Anglo-Saxon name for that generic group of ships that these Norse people, these Northmen, chose to travel in." And the barman says, "Thank you." And the barman says, "What do you get if you cross the Atlantic Ocean in an airship filled with flammable gas?" You get an end to the Zeppelin as a viable form of intercontinental transport, obviously. And the barman says, "What do you get if you cross... what do you get if you cross the Alps and the Pyrenees actually, with a herd of elephants. And the girlfriend says you get a half successful, an aborted invasion of a southern Italian state. Okay, says the barman, what do you get when you cross the Hep BRTS single polypeptide amino acid chain with the immune monophosphoryl QS21 lipid antigen? Which is quite a good question. Well, obviously, says the genetic engineer, you get a recombinant circosaporizite protein vaccine against the Plasmodium falciparum malarial parasite. I would have thought that was obvious. A man who is ambivalent about Marmite walks into the bar. A Burmese physician walks into a bar and the barman says, I recognise you, aren't you Doctor Who? And the Burmese physician says, it's pronounced who. And the barman says, you've changed. You used to be such a charming, modest man when you were still at doctor school. Your mum and her son, which is you, walk into a bar. And the barman says, it's come to my attention that your mother's BMI, that's her body mass index, puts her in a category which, when calculated against the national average, means that she is at higher risk of heart disease than other people of an equivalent age. It's not just heart disease either, it's stroke and aneurysms and type 2 diabetes. And you, the son, replies, well, the thing about you is that your mother's self-esteem is so low that she regularly enjoys congress with multiple sexual partners, sometimes together. And the barman says, well, oddly enough, I too have had sexual intercourse with your mother in her vagina, and your father is a homosexual. A Laotian doctor walks into a bar. That's a doctor from Laos. And the barman, there's a faint flicker of recognition passes across his eyes as he walks in. And he's, aren't you Doctor Who? And the man says, it's obviously pronounced who. And the barman says, you've changed from before you trained as a doctor, when you used to be so unassuming, so slight and unassuming. And you were a kind man. You're a kind, modest man. An unseen force that is known to bind the universe together walks into a bar and is incredibly overbearing, and is told to sit down in the booth with the space-time continuum. And Jesus, Tourette's syndrome, walks into a bar, which is exactly how that joke was written. Dame Tanny Gray Thompson, and Stephen Hawking, and Christopher Reeve walk into the bar, and Jesus says, in your face, ye of little faith. Knock, knock. Knock, knock. Knock, knock. Who's there? It doesn't really matter who. It's always the why that counts. Why are you there? Why? Knock, knock. Why are you there? Knock, knock. Who's there? The function of the joke. The function of the joke, who? It's never the who, it's always the why. I'm a joke. It's my function to be at the door. Knock, knock. Who's there? A joke. Why are you there? I'm fulfilling my function as the punchline of the joke. What am I part of the? What part of the joke am I? What part of the joke am I? Knock, knock. What part of the joke am I? I don't know. Knock, knock. Why? An Irish Republican dissident, stinking of existential angst, who's also wearing a lobster-styled telephone hat, walks into the bar. And the barman says, "I'm sorry, sir, but we don't serve the surreal IRA." An Englishman, a Frenchman, a Scandinavian of some description, a Danish fellow, a German, a Finn, an Ivory Coastian, an Ivorian, a Canadian, a Bolivian, an Australian, a Chinaman, a Vietnamese, a Burmese gentleman, a Japanese, a Swiss, a Spaniard, a Moroccan, a South African, a Chilean, a Madagascan, an American, a Mexican, a Portuguese gentleman, a lady from Indonesia, an Indian, a Pakistani, a Cameroonian, an Italian, a Ukrainian, a Russian, a Norwegian, a Congolese, a Ghanan, a Saudi Arabian, a Yemeni, an Argentinian, a gentleman, and his consort from the Turks and Caicos Islands, a Hungarian, an Austrian, a Czechoslovakian, a Pole, a Uruguayan, a Colombian, a Guatemalan, an Andorran, a Libyan, an Egyptian, an Israeli, a Bhutanese, a Mongolian, a Thai, a Sierra Leonean, a Timorese, a Dutchman, Kofi Annan, and Ban Ki-moon walk into a giant building in New York. Do we have an ending? Do we have an ending, or is this just what it looks like? Do you remember when this was funny? Do you remember when this was funny? Do you remember when it started? Do you remember when this started and it was funny? Or was it? Maybe it wasn't funny then. Do you remember when this used to be funny? Do you remember that?